Hey everyone, welcome back to ONYX Pages and welcome back to Written with Purpose. This is author interview number 5. I'm going to be talking with Eboni J. Dunbar, who I had the opportunity of learning about for the first time, again, because of FIACon 2020, and you should buy your tickets and go to FIACon 2021 because it's a great place to meet authors and to find out about the latest in speculative fiction written by people of color, primarily queer folk. Now, who is Eboni J. Dunbar? Eboni J. Dunbar is a queer Black woman who writes queer and Black speculative fiction. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her partner. She received her BA from Macalester College in England and her MFA in creative writing from Mills College. She is a VONA alum and the managing editor for FIA Literary Magazine. Her work can be found in Stellium Literary Magazine, FIA Literary Magazine, Drabblecast, Anathema, Spec from the Margins, and Nightlight Podcast. She also has a novella out now from Neon Hemlock, and that novella is Stone and Steel. In Stone and Steel, when General Aaliyah returns triumphant to the city of Titus, she expects to find the people prospering under the rule of her queen, the Stone Mage Odessa. Instead, she finds a troubling imbalance in both the citizens' well-being and Odessa's rule. Aaliyah must rely on all of her allies, old and new, to do right by the city that made her. So, what can I say about my discussion with Eboni J. Dunbar? I have to say that when I read her bio and just read the words, she is Black and queer and she writes Black and queer, I was like, yes. Thank you, goddess. You've heard me. I appreciate you. Thank you. It was just amazing to know that there is a writer who finds that it is important to tell the world who she is and also to let us know that she's writing from her perspective and wants us to see ourselves in what she has written. That was the most amazing thing. I'm just so happy that I have the opportunity to talk to her. I hope that you really enjoy my discussion with Eboni Dunbar. There are a couple of questions that she asks in our discussion that I want to pick up in the reflections. So for now, grab a drink, get your notebook out, and enjoy my discussion with Eboni. So first of all, Eboni, thank you very much and thank you very much for agreeing to allowing me to ask you some questions today and to talk to you a little bit about Stone and Steel and about you generally. So I really appreciate that. So I like to first just start with who you are and how you started writing, because whenever I read books, and then when I read the author's bio, I then start getting very curious / nosy about who wrote this book, who they are, how they started writing, how this story came out of them. So I was wondering if we could just start there. Like, how did you start writing? When did you become a writer and how did that happen?
First of all, thank you for having me. And phrasing it as when did you become a writer is that's a hard question, right? Because it's like, when do you start to believe you're a writer versus when did you actually start putting things on the page?
Which is actually a question I would have liked to ask, but now that you put it out there, that's really what I'm curious about.
Oh, the when did you start putting things on paper?
Yeah.
I have been writing since I was a very young child, as I think often happens, right? I was raised a Jehovah's Witness as a child, and so when I would be at meetings, you've got your Sunday service, you've got all kinds of different meetings that you're going to. Mm-hmm. I would find myself writing stories instead of I should have been taking notes probably, but I was actually writing a story off in a corner, and have just sort of always done that. There have been periods in my life where I've had different mediums as my focus. So I was a poet for a little while in college, and that's actually where my MFA focus was in poetry, actually. And then I did a little bit of screenwriting for a while, and then I solidly landed in fiction world several years ago now. Um, and I think that's when I started to feel like a writer, as this like person who um, both like writes things for their own enjoyment, but puts that work out into the world for others to actually interact with.
Mhm.
I think all of the other writing that I had done was really more for me and like less of a probably going to give to other people to digest, I suppose.
Mhm. And then I know that you did your MFA and then you did VONA. I'm not sure if people are familiar with what VONA is. So I was wondering about just how your participation in both of those programs helped you. Like, how does it connect to you getting to the point where Stone and Steel came out? And then also, like, what is the difference? What was the difference and what was more valuable to you in terms of like formal, like academic education
Mm-hmm.
versus the more specialized learning environment that you got through Vona?
Yeah, I actually did Vona while I was still in undergrad. I
Oh,
did Vona right before my senior year, and that was sort of it was a great experience, and I think I wasn't particularly ready for it. So Vona is a summer workshop, although it's had different iterations, I think, in the past several years, but it is a summer workshop. You spend a week with a group of other people of color talking about a particular writing medium. So at that time, like I said, I was writing poetry more, and so that's where I was focused during that time at Vona. And I think I wasn't quite ready for the workshop experience. I was a pretty shy human. I still am a pretty shy human. So just like having to try and warm up to people over the course of a week and present them with your work and also like give them feedback, I think was just a hard thing at that stage of my life. I think probably now I'd still be shy, but I would probably get into it a little bit faster. And then I think I didn't get the full benefit. But it was a great community to be a part of. And I think the great thing about Vona is you are sort of always a part of that community. So even now, right, like I could probably go back and I would probably have a better experience, or I could reach out to like other folks who have done Vona, and would probably be met with open arms. But it definitely was similar and different to getting my MFA. I think academia is a weird place to be. I loved Mills. I loved being there. I think it's great to be in a workshop setting where you're with folks for a longer period of time because you just start to understand who somebody is, both as a person but as a writer, and the way that those two things inform each other. Whereas in a week, right, like I only know this thing that's on the page and maybe a little bit more because we're chatting, but like
yeah.
the full scope of who you are, it's hard to tell sometimes, right? If like what you're reading is, oh, this is what you believe and this is who you are and this is the way you always write, or this is something you were experimenting with and so like doesn't actually represent you. And when you're in the academic setting, you actually have the time to say, oh no, this aligns with the way that you think, or this aligns with the way that you are as a person. And that can mean many different interesting things. It is also like the most expensive thing that you could possibly get, right? It's like, why get an MFA in creative writing? I'm not sure now having done it, I'm like, I'm not sure I should have spent that money that way. I don't write poetry, although I think definitely, as a poet, I was an overwriter. As a fiction writer, I'm an underwriter. So, maybe they inform each other in that way. But it's just a very expensive thing if you're not going to teach, right? Like I think part of me had thought, oh, I'll be a teacher when I finish. I will go and do professorships. But even that landscape is changing so much, right? That now you have folks who have a PhD in creative writing, and so that's going to get people more interested than somebody who just has an MFA. And I didn't have a ton of teaching experience, so that degree does me very little good most of the time. It maybe bumps me up in somebody's estimation, but I don't feel like I use that education as much as I wish I did for the amount of money that I spent on it. Which is both not to say that the experience wasn't good. It definitely was, but was it $50,000 good? I don't know.
Right. And what do you mean when you say that you're, as in fiction, you're an underwriter, like from a fiction perspective? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I am the sort of person who I am both. So I'm a pantser. I never outline. The few times I have outlined, I have not finished writing the thing. So I tend not to do that. But then when I write, I tend to write very concisely, like just get to the point, right? And what you want to read when you're actually reading is a little bit more lush than that, depending on the kind of person you are. I like a little bit more. Um, I like things to be a little shorter, a little tighter, a little faster. But lots of people want more description when they read. So I often, as an editor, have to go back and say, okay, where can I add more detail? Where can I add additional pieces? So that's what I mean, what I underwrite. As a poet, I was always like writing these long things, and people would be like, you could probably cut 90% of those words. And I'm like, no, what? You need all of them. And now I'm like, okay, well, you probably need to add like 90% more words. So like,
Right.
it's not enough.
I like sparse writing. I think part of it is because I'm a lawyer, and so we're
Mm,
we're taught to just say what needs to be said, and then to listen for the main thing, and then everything else falls away. So I'm typically like attracted to shorter works, also time,
yeah.
attracted to shorter works, but I like sparse writing. I like the deliberateness of it. And I also find that like with shorter works and sparser writing, it it forces the writer to be to be more thoughtful perhaps about what they're giving us, because they're not giving us eight things, they're giving us one thing, so that
Yep.
one thing has to be the thing, right? um and so I love looking at those choices and thinking about like, why did they give us, why did we get a paragraph, a backstory on this character but not on this character, right? So
Yes.
those are all really interesting questions, for me. And but I first want to talk about this. I want to talk about the author, because the first thing you say, or whoever wrote this, I'm assuming you wrote
That was me.
Okay, good. You can never be sure. Um, but the first thing it says is Ebony Dunbar is a queer Black woman who writes queer Black speculative fiction. As a queer Black woman who almost exclusively reads Black speculative fiction and wants to like really get more Black queer speculative fiction, I was like,
Mhm.
I was like, it was like the heavens opened up, and it was just like, here's your book, and Njeri, written for you. And I've been feeling that way as I've come into more Black queer speculative fiction. And Chloe from Thistle and Verse, who's one of the leads for the solar powered Afrofuturism solar reading group, she's the person who got me to find out about Stone and Steel. And she's super amazing. So I was really excited when I found out about this, about your novella. But tell me about leading with that, right? Leading with you being queer, a queer Black woman writing queer Black speculative fiction. Why did you lead with that? Why do readers need to know that? And then what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, first, I love that you were so connected to that, but I think that's part of the reason to do it, right? Is like, it's twofold. So, number one is I want it to be easy for people to say, here's exactly what she's doing, and is that what I want? Yes, absolutely. Great. Now you've got what you want. And if it's not, cool, move on, because you know exactly what you're getting from me. There's no questions. The other reason I did that is because at the time that I was getting serious about writing is the same time FIA actually was starting to like come up and like be created, and that Black Speculative report came out from Fireside saying, right, like there aren't a ton of authors who are in short fiction who are Black who are being published, and like, is that because there's not enough? Is that because um, you know publishers aren't actually publishing them? And a lot of what magazines were saying was, oh, well, we don't know. How would we know that somebody is Black? How would we know? I can't figure it out. What's happening? So I said, great, let me make it very clear to you. I'm a Black woman. I'm a queer Black woman. I have all of these things that make up my identity. Now you have no question. If you're saying no, that's fine. But if you're saying yes, right, like what does that also mean? You're going to be able to tell, right, as you read through the other bios in your magazine, there's only one person here who says that, and that's the first person in 6 months that we've seen. Is that what we want? Why is that? What's happening there? Then there's no excuse for you to say, "Oh, I didn't know," because it's in my bio. You can't say you didn't know. It's right there.
What's the relationship between your identity and then what you write? Like, do you write black queer speculative fiction because you are a black queer woman, or like do you feel like, not that you're limited, but is that sort of what your vocation, or what you need to be doing, or what you feel called to write because of who it is you are?
Yeah, 1,000%. I think I could write anything and that would be fine. What
Yeah.
I want to write is what I want to read, right? What I want to write is people who are like me, women who are black, who are queer, who are hopefully happy, who are headed towards happiness in some form or fashion, right? Like maybe not.
Happy adjacent or happy
Yes,
aspiring.
yes. Headed towards happiness, maybe not there quite yet, but you can see the trajectory. You know where they're headed. Um, I think that's important. It's important because there's not enough of it, right? Like, and we're very lucky to live in a time when like more and more of it is showing up on the shelves, and that's so exciting. And at the same time, it's never going to be enough. Like you look around at the breadth of speculative fiction and the number of white men, the number of white women, the number of straight people, and it's like that's great. And also, I need like just as much, if not more, of black, of queer, of all of the other sort of, I guess, marginalizations that we possibly can, because
Mhm.
all of that is just as important, sometimes more in my estimation, as that other existing work. And so that's what I want to do, right? I want to write the stories that I would have wanted when I was growing up, that I want to read right now. Even still, I'm like, wait, this is cool, but give me the queer stuff, give me the queer black stuff.
Mm.
And I'm just super excited about that.
As a writer of speculative fiction, is that sort of where you want to live? Do you see yourself exploring outside of the world of the speculative?
I think it's possible. I am also an avid romance reader, and obviously, there's always a romantic story in anything I write, pretty much. So I could
Mhm.
totally see myself veering more towards romance. But I love playing with magic. I love building different worlds. I love the possibilities that come with being in the speculative space. Stone and Steel is a perfect example of like, I don't, you, there's not, we don't live in a world where everybody's queer pretty much, and it's not a question, it's not something we have to discuss, it just is. And that's something only fantasy could give you, right? Or only a super future sci-fi could give you, is this imagining of a world where we're just okay and everybody's fine, and it sucks that that's the way it is, but like that's not something we have in our reality, and I love being able to play with that in the speculative space.
It kind of, as you say that, Ebony, I'm thinking about like a couple of things. Like, it's, if you are, I remember Samuel R. Delaney saying this, right? So he was asked about, um, his writing and whether he saw his writing as Afrofuturist.
Hmm.
Um, and so I don't know, I'm saying this. I asked him that. And the reason I asked him that was because I hadn't really read him call himself that really
Hmm.
at that
Hmm.
time. And his answer was that he wrote a story about like a group of gay men living together, having sex with each other, being like autonomous and having agency. And he's like, that is Afrofuturism. Like, that's, I don't know what's more Afrofuturist than that, right? Because that is
Yeah.
science fiction for a lot of people. Um, and I wonder, like, if the mere act of writing a world where, as you say, everyone is queer, everyone is of color, and it's just not a question. Not only that, but like gender spectrums are norms, like normative of children, elders, everyone. That if you're writing that world, it is going to be speculative at this particular point, but it might not be in 50 years or 100 years, but today, it is. So
Yeah.
to dedicate yourself to writing Black queer anything means that there's going to have to be some sort of speculative aspect to it, right? That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for making yourself so easy to find, and for being so deliberate, because as a reader, it can be challenging to know, is this person queer? Because own voices matters to me. I know that for some people it's a controversial concept, but as a queer Black woman, it makes a difference to me whether the person has a lived experience that is similar to the characters that they're writing, right? Regardless of whether, because some own voices writers don't write their characters well, like that's where talent comes in, right? And skill. But it is meaningful in terms of whose work I want to buy, like who I want to support to keep on writing.
Yeah. There's just a little bit of trust you can give, right? Like if you're dealing with somebody who has had that experience, even if it's not yours, right? Like which
Yeah.
so often is true. Yeah, this isn't my experience, but I know that it might be similar to yours. I have a little bit more trust. And to your point, right, that doesn't mean you're going to write it perfectly or
Yeah.
in a way I would want to read it, but at least I know it's close to the way you feel or to your experience.
And that if it's and for me, like if you give me something different, like if you give me a character that I look at a little bit sideways and like, that's weird, I'll be like, yeah, but that's not because Ebony doesn't know the life. It's
Yes.
because Ebony made that character weird, right? And we can talk
Hopefully
to
it's
Ebony about
intentional.
her choices. Not talking about anybody in particular, but just, so okay. So now let's talk about Stone and Steel, which I love. The only thing I didn't like about it is that it ended. So how did Stone and Steel come about? What was your inspiration for writing this novella?
I always say Stone and Steel is Brent Lambert's fault on the FIA team, because he was running the Voices on FIA initiative, which is hosted generally in November. It didn't happen last year because of FIACon. But so generally it's in November. Instead of doing National Novel Writing Month, hey folks, write some short stories. So he was putting out prompts daily, and one of the prompts he gave was Game of Thrones meets. I think only the first book was out at the time, but I'm gonna say the Broken Earth trilogy. And I was like, yeah, okay, sure, cute. So what I wrote for that prompt was actually the moment that Aaliyah and Odessa took the throne from the former king.
Okay.
And so like Odessa sort of coming into her power and Aaliyah being like both excited and also a little bit like, this was the right plan, right? Okay. Yes, no, this is good. She's queen now. This is awesome. And from there, I was like, well, I bet I could write a little bit. I kind of want to know what happens after that moment because that's a cool moment. That's the moment most people write about, right? It's like the lead up to, hey, we got the throne. And I was kind of interested in yeah, okay, you got it, but what did you do with it afterwards? And so that's the inspiration for Stone and Steel. Is like, okay, what happens after you win the throne? You being the person you said you were going to be the liberator and this new different kind of leadership. Are you actually? What does it mean when you're not actually? And what do you have to do to fix the mistakes you made?
So when people ask you to describe, I'm still learning to give like really succinct synopses of stories. So when people ask you to describe, so you wrote a book? What's your book about? What's Stone and Steel about? How do you answer?
Yeah, I say Stone and Steel is about a general who realizes that the person she put into power is not the person she thought she was, and having to sort of choose between the love of her kingdom, of the many people that represents, and the love of her heart, of this person she has grown up with and loved, and just having to make that choice. Yeah, that's probably the most succinct description I can give of it, and because then you got to add more things.
Yeah. And on my channel, like for people who watch these interviews, like I like getting into the story. I don't really care about spoilers unless you do. So I'll leave it up to you in terms of how much detail you want to give. I'm happy with you just doing it because I just finished reading it and I have questions. Um, so so I really love that first moment when you have like, General Aaliyah coming back with her soldiers, and it's very atmospheric, and you can see them like, oh, there's home, and what's it going to be like, and how are people going to respond, and all of those things. Um, and so I guess my first question about the story itself, right? I mean, it's a novella, so you have to choose how much you give us in terms of the world. What were the most important elements that you needed the reader to see sort of right off the bat in order to appreciate General Aaliyah's sort of journey through this story?
Yeah, I think you had to understand almost immediately that she hasn't been home in a very long time, right? So it's not that she like has been in and out and could have seen all of this stuff. She's in a moment where no, I this is my first real time being here, and so it's my first opportunity to actually say, "Huh, this doesn't look right. Something here is not working out." Um, which I think is really important for just understanding who Aaliyah is as a person, because I don't think if Aaliyah had been going back and forth, I don't think she could have continued her journey without saying like, and how are we fixing this? And what's happening here? What's going on? She really had to be so removed that coming back is like, oh, this is a wake up call for me.
Mm.
And then I think just giving an opportunity to understand a little bit about her relationship to the people, like that first moment where she is coming into the city and she's like, hey everybody, so excited to see you, you don't look that excited to see me, but like there's many reasons why that could be. And then that moment she has with the kids where she's like, huh, y'all are not dressed well, you look underfed, you look under cared for, that's a problem for me. And it's a problem for her. It like gives a little bit of her backstory as well, because that's where she comes from. She was a kid on the street, so she knows what that looks like probably better than most people might, right? Like if you had a general who'd been a general and like been in the upper crust their whole life, whatever, that looks like what I'm used to. But to her, as somebody who knows what that is, knows what it's like to live that life, it hits different, right? Like you just aren't going to be able to walk by and say, maybe that's a one off. To her, that's very important. She doesn't want that to be the case for anyone.
Yeah, Walida Imarisha, and I forget the other person that she created this framework with for visionary fiction. Like one of the things that they talk about is the importance of having the point of view, the main point of view of a story, becoming from the character who's a character who is marginalized, or even ideally the most marginalized, and building on that. I think it's important that you have somebody who a narrator who you can trust to engage the world in a really critical way. Um, and I found that General Aaliyah was able to do that. She saw through the bullshit really, really early, like immediately,
Mm-hmm.
and continued to see like it was like almost the whole story was written like through her side eye, in my view, right? Like there was nothing
I
that she
love that.
nothing was she fully took for granted at all. Like everything sort of had to be proven to her, and she needed to kind of understand, and she's sort of looking like, okay, can I trust what I'm seeing? Can I trust what I'm feeling? I'm looking for evidence. Let me go and speak to somebody who I trust, right? So enter Mercy, enter like the Ville, and that was like my favorite place. I loved Blue. I loved so many children, which is a question I have because like that's something that I don't see as often, especially stories that are about like have a lot of fighting and soldiers and war and that kind of thing. Um, but you give us more. You give us more of the Ville, and you give us more of uh, more dialogue and relationship between people who would have been considered the underclass and had the experience of being part of the underclass than you do the royalty. And even when you give us royalty, you gave us royalty in relation to in relation with and from the perspective of people who would have be considered not even the middle class but the underclass.
Yeah.
Why did you do that?
Like I said, I think it's important that that's where Aaliyah comes from, because
Mm.
it just is it, it's like her motivation for everything that she does is about improving things so that people don't end up like her. I think that's a similar feeling that a lot of Black people have, right? Of like, I want to make things better for my community in the future. Not everyone, obviously, but I think I would hope a majority of people feel that way of like, I want things to be better in the future, if not for everyone, at least for my child. And I think Aaliyah sort of sees the world that way, and I wanted her to see the world that way. And so it's even more important, right? She's not just the person who said, I'm going to fight with this person over here. I'm going to back this person's play. She said, no, we've got this. We can handle it. Now, she picked the wrong person to say this is the person who can handle it and run things. But I think that also speaks to her heart, and I think that's just an important piece as well, is that she is both really tough. She is both like from the underclass, to your point, and she wants the best for everyone. She has an exceptional heart. Yes, she was slinging drugs at a different time. She has probably killed lots of people, whether in war or not. Mm-hmm. But her heart is always in a good place, and she's always trying to do the best thing for the people around her. And I just think that's an important perspective to have on the page. I think there is a like slightly different but similar narrative in L.D. Lewis's novella A Ruin of Shadows, which I think if you read the two, like this is definitely takes some of its inspiration from that. Because in that novella, the main character is an older woman. She has helped win an empire, and she's also tired, and she also like can see all of the inner workings of things. And I think Aaliyah is very similar in that, like, yeah, it's important to know that the people who often would be cannon fodder, right, actually have thoughts and opinions and things to say moving forward. Ooh.
Okay, so, all right. So our internet doesn't want us to be great, but we're going to be great anyway, which is fine. So do you remember what you were saying last, or would you like me to just move on to my other questions about the children?
I think we were talking about the importance of Aaliyah's perspective being from the most marginalized position. And I'm sure I was just rambling. I don't know how cohesive it is. Maybe I'll just wrap it up and say, I think it's important because it's not an experience we get enough of, right? Like, you do see the sort of like peasant to king narrative, but I don't think you see the hustler to king narrative or the hustler to queen narrative. And that I think is important as well.
I definitely agree. I'd like to know about the children. I counted, like, for me, 3 very prominent or relatively prominent children characters. And I found it unusual to see so many children, even those who were sort of in the background, but you made a point of like bringing them into the story. Can you tell us about the importance of characters who are children in stories like these?
Yeah, I think it was important because children are so impacted by all of the things that happen when we're talking about war and the changing of leadership and all of these things, and yet they so often end up forgotten, right? Like, we don't get to see a lot of the, like, how did this change impact the way this person grew up, or will impact the way this person grew up? And in that same way of, like, let's explore what happens when you take the crown and think you're doing better, we also kind of see the people who are most marginalized, right? It's kids who can't take care of themselves or aren't able to just say, like, hey, I'm going to do this and make it make sense. Because they're young and they're not supposed to. And what they should get is to be taken care of, but they're not. And what does that look like? And what does that mean they have to do? And I think that's just as important of an experience as you know, looking at folks who are in the underclass or who are from that most marginalized position.
Okay. And in terms of, like, the relationships, you said that you could see yourself writing romance and that there were romantic elements throughout the story. And I really I love seeing queer romance. I love seeing non-monogamy. I love the normalizing of non-monogamy. And you did that in your right away, like right off the bat. And I think that's really important, and I felt very seen in doing that. Did you have to did that affect the other parts of the story, or did you have to shift things in order to create space for those kinds of relationships and that degree of intimacy?
No. I think it was actually so much easier than, I imagine a lot of people would say it is, right? And maybe that's because my own experience as a queer woman makes it easier for me to go, yeah, and everybody's queer, and nobody cares. And you get to sleep with this person, and you get to sleep with that person, and nobody cares. Because, it just isn't a thing, or it shouldn't be, right? This is just as normal and everyday, and I'm using quotation marks because you can't see that, as is the straight person who is completely monogamous and, only married their high school sweetheart, and that's the only person they've ever been with, or was a virgin, is a virgin still, and will only give their virginity to one human being. All of those things are valid, and I'm not sure why we have to walk around pretending that they're not.
Yeah, I hear you. I know that we have some... Are you still there? Okay, good. I appreciate your choices on that, and I noticed that in the blurbs, a lot of the people who were blurbers, I don't know, said that they really responded to how sexy, and how sexual the story was, or how there were sexual elements to it, and I very much appreciated that. And I guess my last question is about, well, it's twofold. Where can we, what's happening next for you? Where can we find more of your work? And then I know you're very involved in the Black science fiction and fantasy community, particularly, well, I'll just let you decide to say what you do most. I won't name that for you. But if people want to find out more about your writing, and also if they want to find more Black queer writers and Black queer speculative fiction, where would you point us?
So in terms of my work, you could definitely go to my website, which is just ebonydunbar.com. Super easy to find more of my short fiction. At some point, hopefully, I will get an agent and publish some novel-length work. That's what I'm working on right now. But no takers yet. We'll see. And then in terms of thinking about spaces to look for other Black spec fic, I am the managing editor at Fire Literary Magazine, which publishes short fiction through novelette length from Black speculative fiction writers, and I think that we have just an exceptional range of folks who have been published many times, folks who are debut writers. So it is a great space to check out to start a relationship with a new author for you. And obviously I'm a little bit biased in my opinion there, but I think that's true. And also, I briefly mentioned FIACon earlier. It is taking place in September this year, and FIACon is what we lovingly call BIPOC plus. So centering those of us who are not often centered in the conference and convening space. So that is also happening and very awesome, and a great way to interact with authors who are new to you, if not new to the space, because it's just a wide breadth of folks from different backgrounds and different experiences, and I think those are both great ways to start you off if you're looking for ways to engage more with Black speculative fiction, with queer speculative fiction, all of the above.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for Stone and Steel. I really appreciate you being flexible today with now the technology issue. We will definitely work that out. And I'll make sure that we have links to you on the socials and to Faya, which I love very much as well, in the description. So thanks so much, Eboni.
Thank you, Njeri. This has been really great. Such a fun conversation.
Hey everyone, I hope that you really enjoyed my chat with Eboni Dunbar. There are a number of different things that I want to focus on. I have to say though, when I read Stone and Steel, I noticed that there was, it was obviously a very, very different story, but I just thought it was interesting that I read The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke and then Stone and Steel within the same month or so. And I just really have learned something about myself, and that is that I want more Black queer characters with weapons. That's a thing that I need more of in my life. And there's a sexiness to that. So there's also that. But I think there are three things that I want to talk about. So number one is, what happens when your reality, the perfect world that you want to see, is somebody else's fantasy? And what happens when the only way that a world can exist in which you would be safe is if it were a speculative world or a fantasy world? That's just something that is really difficult for me. And Eboni talked about that in our discussion, and it makes me sad and also hopeful, but it's very true. For Black queer folks like me, it is within the realm of the plausible to be safe and cared for in this world. But for a lot of people, a world where trans folks, queer folks, people with disabilities, indigenous folks can live to our highest potential and love freely and be safe at all times in that is almost fantasy sometimes. And that hurts my heart. But it's one of the reasons why it's so important to read this work so that it becomes normalized, that everywhere at all times we will all be safe and loved. So I also want to talk about this idea of writing what you want to read. And in the comments below, I'd be really interested in what are some of the fantasy worlds that you want to read, that you want to maybe just be enveloped in, that haven't been written yet. I'd love to hear that. And if you've come across books that really answered your desire for community and a fantastical world in which you would be centered, I'd love to hear what those books were for you. So the last thing is this whole idea of what happens after the win, right? So a lot of times, sometimes our epic fantasies or our military fantasies are about the fight. So we overthrow the king, we overthrow the empress, the chosen one, ends up getting the throne and whatever, all of that stuff happens. But then what happens after that? What do they do with the power that they have? And of course, those of you who did political science will know this quote that, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, or something like that. I don't know. But this idea that if you have everything you fought for, will you still be true to what you fought for? And taking up that question in this way was really exciting for me to see. So if you had an opportunity to read Stone and Steel, I would love to hear what you thought about it. And I would also like to turn your attention to Chloe from Thistle and Verse. Chloe is a booktuber, one of the co-leads of the solar-powered Afrofuturism slow reading group on Facebook. And she is just an epic researcher of all things Black science fiction and fantasy, and it was because of Chloe that I found out about this book. So thank you, Chloe. Credit where credit is due. All right, so let us choose chaos. Let me get those cards. If you're new here, you will know that I am choosing a card for each of my videos because this is going to be your ticket to enter the draw for the Melanin Eclectic 2022 Undated Reading Planner that is currently on pre-order until September 30th. So if you want to try and win one, you need to do the following 4 things. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video, and answer the prompt in the Harvest of Survival affirmation deck. Let me choose my card. I'm gonna choose like this one. This is an Octavia E. Butler quote. There is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. This quote is actually the quote that inspired the title of the anthology of original speculative work by people of color called New Suns, which was edited by Nisi Shaw, which I read and have reviewed, so you'll see something here, and is so good, so check it out. Now, the question is, what are you birthing into existence? How does that connect with our discussion? It totally does, because when Eboni said, I wanted to write the worlds that I wanted to write what I wanted to read, that is an example of birthing something into existence, right? Taking something that I, in my brain, want to see and making it happen and putting it out there, that is absolutely magical. And Eboni did it. A lot of the writers that we're talking about in this series have done it, and I'm sure you do it as well. So what are you birthing into existence? It could be anything. If you answer the question in the comments below and do the other 3 things, you will be entered into a draw for a 2022 Melanin Eclectic Reading Planner. All right, everyone, thank you so much for watching video number 5 in the Written with Purpose author series. I will see you in my next video. Remember to read with purpose. Bye.